Twitch, and Facebook Live. And today my guest is Kahmali Rose of the Radical Democracy. Let me get him on screen real quick.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, hello, Kahmali.
Hey,
How
Andrew,
are
how's
you
it
doing
going?
today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate that.
Yes, I'm glad to have you on as well. So I was wondering, are you a Celtics fan?
I am not really. I grew up on I grew up in Boston, so I grew up on the Celtics, and I'm more of a player than a fan of watching the sport. To be honest, it's one of the my I can watch like the last quarter of a basketball game, but that's mostly all I can stand because I feel like the first three quarters are just too much back and forth, and everything seems to get decided in the last like 5 minutes of a basketball game. So I was much more of a football fan growing up than anything else, and watched a lot of the Bruins as well, just because I find hockey to be a little bit more of exciting of a sport to watch. But I like the Celtics. I've been to a few of their games, and I generally follow them through the playoffs, but not a hardcore fan by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I was gonna ask because I felt like last night was one of the more interesting nights of the NBA playoffs,
Yeah,
especially with the
absolutely. Yeah.
the Nuggets being able
Yeah.
to close that series out in 6 games, and also the Suns catching the break again with Anthony Davis and being able to close out this series as well.
Yeah.
And before I got more politically engaged, I was mainly a sports account, and I felt like last night was one of the more uh, lit up nights for NBA Twitter that has happened in a while.
Yeah, I feel like even left Twitter was like on fire. People. You would think that leftists would be a little less, into sports in general, just because the sort of tribalism, that comes along with it, and for leftists, that's not always. We're trying to reach across all these different, uh, you know, artificial boundaries and things like that, and try to have an internationalist, cosmopolitan perspective. So we don't want to feel like we're competing against one another. We're cooperating together instead. But even on the left, it's like it's still fun. It's still sports is
Yeah,
sports, and we all grew up on them, and it's hard to shake that. So even on left Twitter, I feel like it was a lot of the discussion was around just and NBA playoffs and Trey Young and LeBron and just folks all happen to drop their commentary in there.
yes, I even saw Sky Daddy point that out last night as well.
Yep, no, I caught that too.
So, about to ask you about what happened in the garden on Sunday.
Yep, Kyrie Irving action.
Oh, sorry, it's not exactly easy to. Yeah,
No,
now we got it.
nice.
So we saw on Sunday night Celtic, after the Brooklyn Nets won Game 4, that Kyrie Irving went to midcourt and stepped on the Celtics logo. Then we, then this is what followed with the fan who tried to throw the water bottle at Kyrie Irving.
Yep.
Just going to take a look at this quick. So, what were your thoughts on this incident?
Yeah, I thought, this for somebody that's watched Boston sports a lot, it doesn't surprise me. We have some of the worst sports fans on the planet here in Boston, especially after the run that a lot of the sports teams have gone on here, particularly with the Patriots. And then, we just had a run there where it felt like the Boston teams just couldn't lose. And that really just kind of reinforced the mass wholeness of the Boston sports population. And so we are kind of known for I mean, Boston sports fans, there's a history of racism. I mean, Boston is one of the most racist cities I've been in my lifetime, and I've been around a few, and so I've seen, I've experienced the covert to the overt here in Boston, and our sports fans can be, some of the worst in that regard. Whether it's baseball, Red Sox fans, the Bruins fans with PK Subban a few years back, and now you have Kyrie Irving, and so I think that you just kind of like the an unnecessary thing, throwing a bottle at a sports player. It's somebody on the job. Like these are workers. I mean, they are in a different class, obviously, of worker, just from the type of money that they make in celebrity culture. So from a class perspective, of course, they are sort of in a different class than your average working class person, of course. But these are working people doing a job. It's not, we shouldn't be rising to the level of assaulting anyone. The fan that threw the bottle, it almost hit Kyrie Irving, didn't hit him. But it's still an attempted assault. It's still, nobody wants anybody showing up to their job and like whipping a water bottle at their face. So none of us would appreciate that. So definitely seemed like, that action of stepping on a logo in the center court is not the same. Terrell Davis did something like that a while back, I think. And it's seen as a sign of disrespect, but honestly, I mean, this is an inanimate object. It's a piece of property. It's a logo, a slightly, a bit of a racist logo, if we're really being real, with the, like leprechaun. If I were Irish, I might be a little offended by by that one right there. But yeah, so not by the stepping so much as the iconography of Lucky, the leprechaun, for the Boston Celtics mascot. But yeah, so I don't think that his action warranted that kind of reaction. And I also, I'm not somebody, I don't believe in really like harsh like penalties for this was an attempt at a violent crime, but no violence was actually committed. Nobody was hit. Let them, whatever the case is, they banned him from the TD, from the Garden. And what else can you do? They're gonna take him to court. He went to court. He's been arrested and went to court and all that sort of stuff. I don't want to see anybody go to jail over anything like this, especially when it's like a working class person probably threw something at a rich person. Like I'm not gonna lose sleep for Kyrie Irving by any stretch of the imagination. Especially since he's a flat earther. But no, just kidding. But yeah, so I don't know. It was a typical Boston asshole sports fan kind of move, and it's really unfortunate that we got to rise to the level of like physical assault. Definitely some racist, under and possibly overtones to actions like that when it's a sport that's typically dominated by black men primarily, and you got what appears to be a white fan throwing a full water bottle at somebody's head. It's definitely some. They're not charging him with any kind of like hate crime or anything like that. To anyone that might freak out about that, it's nothing like that. But it is, it's definitely something that deserves mention in it. And so unfortunate to see, and a really shitty thing to do for the fan. I think that the response of just like banning him from the Garden was appropriate and seems fair to me.
Yeah, I lost the first couple minutes of what you said due to my connection getting weak, but when I saw that Kyrie Irving stepped on that logo, I felt like the only people who really could should have the right to have a physical response to that are players and staff of the Boston Celtics. But at the time he did it, most of them were already leaving the court, and that's and as fans, you should know better not to do that, because just based on the different levels of punishment of loan, you're going to get banned and fined. While if a someone on the Celtics did it, you're probably only going to see a fine if you took offense to that as well. And
Yep, absolutely.
as the and it was kind of something that was building up with Kyrie Irving bringing up the racism in Boston, and I think it just gets the discussion on that gets put in an unproductive direction because the racism is just being this Celtics with three Ks at the end instead of acknowledging the actual liberal racism that takes place in Boston because Massachusetts is a liberal state.
Absolutely, by
Then
all
you,
stretch of
you
the imagination, 80% of our legislature is Democratic Party. This is absolutely seen as one of the more liberal states in the entire country.
then you also have the issues that any other big city would have is you're always going to have more conservative suburbs surrounding it as well.
Absolutely, and the typically liberals and conservatives, there's not a ton of distance between those two at this stage of our sort of political progression in this country. There's they agree on, I would say, on the vast majority of things, in particular economics, and more so even on social issues. Like people are past the point of like overt racism, at least in the sort of moderate wing of the, like more moderate conservatives, and really folks that identify as conservative, really, I think, and folks that would identify as liberal are going to agree on a lot. And yeah, there's no doubt about it that there is a ton of the sort of covert racism that you experience from white liberals, and particularly in Boston. One of the things like about Boston is that like we have some of the worst wealth inequality in the entire country. There was a study done in 2017 specific to Boston, and they measured the median income of white families versus non-immigrant black families, as well as immigrant black families, Latino families. But the disparity between white families and black families, the median white family in Boston had a net wealth of $247,000 for the median white family, meaning median means half of all white families have less than that, half of all white families have more than that. And that was $247,000 for white families. For black families, it was $8 in Boston. So $247,000 of wealth versus $8. So half of all black families in Boston have less than $8 of total wealth. Most are, the majority of those are folks that are in debt for all kinds of reasons. Credit debt, credit card debt, student loan debt, all types of reasons. And so we have a ton of income inequality here, and I think that you see that a lot in liberal cities all around the country. There's sort of this like fractal inequality that we have all over the world, where it's like even within a city you see inequality. Certain parts of the town are way wealthier than other parts, the projects versus like the north end sort of areas versus like Dorchester, Mattapan type areas. And then you have wealth inequality between urban and suburban areas versus you have wealth inequality between states, you have wealth inequality between countries as well. And so it's like you see it at every level, and you definitely see it here in Boston to an extreme level. And I think that creates a lot of sort of room for that, what we've grown accustomed to with the liberal, white liberal covert racism, and sort of like colorblind, I don't see color, that sort of mentality. And so yeah, I think that it's something that goes, people often when they hear liberal state or liberal city, they think, oh, it must be like a progressive sort of like bastion. But the reality is there is a ton of, again, not just covert racism, but I've seen a ton of and experienced a ton of overt racism. I grew up with like 5 foot long dreads, and at a time when it was not popular, and it was, it got me a lot of attention in schools, and not the type of attention I necessarily would have wanted. And that was right here in Boston, liberal Boston.
So that was great that you brought up some numbers on the wealth inequality in Boston, and we'll break down some numbers later on in our inner conversation here. But one last thing I wanted to ask you about this whole Boston Celtics incident is Danny Ainge, since he denied the comments of Kyrie Irving bringing up the racism that happens in the Garden, along with previous comments about him not caring to hear about the political opinions of NBA players as well. So, what did you think of the fallout for Danny Ainge deciding to step down?
Yeah, I think that Ainge is somebody that has that sort of typical, colorblind, sort of liberal colorblind attitude of, well, I don't see it, I don't experience it, I'm not seeing it, and so I don't see color kind of thing. When the reality is like, the black players are forced to see color and they're forced to hear it, and they're definitely this is not unique to any single Boston sport. So it's not like there's no reason why the NBA would be immune to this, particularly since they have an overwhelming majority of their players are black players. And so, but you see it even in, again, the NHL has been known, the PK Subban came down here and was called the N word by a Boston sports fan. The baseball players have said that the most racist stadium that they've played in, where they've heard the most racist insults, is Fenway Stadium, the Red Sox stadium. And so this is not a secret to anyone. And so I think for Ainge, he's out of touch with reality, and with the reality for not just his players, but for black and brown sports fans as well, that are exposed to that and have to deal with that, because it's not just the players in that situation that are having to deal with that sort of rhetoric. You get that if you're an outside sports fan, and even if you're just a Celtic sports fan, or a Celtic sports fan, but a black Celtic sports fan, and you're forced to hear those kind of racist insults being lobbed at players, and it can't help but feel personal in that instance as well. And so I think that for Danny Ainge, him stepping down, I think that it's the right time and right thing to do at this point. He is out of touch with not just the players, but the fan base as well, and the marginalized folks within that fan base. So
So, before we move on, I was wondering, were you familiar with Rhode Island at all?
yeah, I travel there, every now and again.
Yeah, I was just wondering because my dad, he grew up in Pawtucket before he moved to Denver. So I know that he could attest to some of the growing up in like the segregation before he came to higher altitude here, since it was better for his health. And I also remember experience my dad talking about going to some James Brown concert, and him and the other people being there were some of the only white people that went.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I can imagine, like the further back you go, I'm sure it was even more blatant and brazen, the types of situations you would experience and see and witness. And so I absolutely am not surprised by that whatsoever. I think that it's if you've been in this area, that you've seen the segregation firsthand. Like, everyone thinks that the South is so segregated, but the reality is that the North is immensely segregated. And even in these liberal places, again, you may have people living in the same town or city, but within that town or city, there is intense segregation happening, where there's the nice part of the city where the upper class, primarily white folks, are living, and then you have these sort of projects, and that happens right within Boston. You have places like the North End, and the North Shore, and places like that, and you compare that to like a Chelsea Revere, a Dorchester Mattapan, versus what's going on in those areas, and you see something very different. And so you got your Brooklines, Brightons, very some of the wealthiest districts in the entire country are here in Massachusetts and suburbs of Boston, and then you have some of the most disparaged communities in the primarily black and brown poor neighborhoods, Dorchester, Mattapan, and areas like that. So yeah, doesn't surprise me at all to hear that segregation existed then, and it still exists to this day. So yeah, I don't think that the goals of integration have ever really been realized in any meaningful way.
Yeah. So I grew up in a pretty strong majority Hispanic neighborhood, and I think that's really shaped my experience in a different way than someone who mainly grows up around white people. I mean, I even spent part of my high school at one that's over 80% Hispanic and only about 10% white. And for example, in my freshman French class, I was the only white person in there and also happened to be the only one in there that didn't know Spanish at all. Even the French teacher who was Haitian even knew Spanish as well.
Yep. Yeah, and I agree. I think that does give you a very different perspective than your sort of what is more typical in this country, which is because of the white majority, the typical probable thing is that you're going to grow up around primarily white folks. And so I also grew up in a very diverse, like in very diverse neighborhoods, and went to some pretty diverse schools here in Boston. And so that was my experience as well, was growing up around all kinds of folks, but in a majority minority city, which is that's why you got like Ayanna Pressley in Congress representing my what was my district for most of my life.
So yesterday, some quotes have been leaking out from Barack Obama's interview with Erza Klein, and one of the key ones from it was Barack Obama says Joe Biden is finishing the job of his presidency. So when you see Obama say that and what Joe Biden has done so far, what do you think of this statement?
I mean, I think it's consistent. I just think that it's not the like glowing review and analysis of Biden's administration thus far that he may think it is. Yes, by and large, he is. This is essentially an Obama 2.0. He's done a few things that some could consider slightly more progressive than Obama, like not totally bailing out just the banks and wealthiest corporations, but also throwing a little bone to working people. But we know, I mean, Donald Trump gave more money in cash, more cash to more people than Joe Biden even did up till this point. And we've seen the so many of the Trump era policies continued, which were continuations of by and large the Obama era policies. I think that between these switches between Republicans being in power at the federal level and Democrats, it seems almost mostly cosmetic at this point, because the policies that end up being enacted and are by and large nearly identical to what you'd be getting out of either party. And so you got Biden here, the Haitian deportations. He's deported more Haitian migrants than in just his first 100 days than Trump deported in an entire term. And we had record numbers of kids in cages under Biden. We've gotten no rise and no increase in the minimum wage. That was a major fight. We still haven't gotten a vote on something like single payer. And so we're continuing with the ACA and that whole mess of the gift to private health insurance that is. And so, what's changed since the Obama era? By and large, nothing. We're still, we claim we're going to get out of Afghanistan, but we've already delayed that. That was supposed to happen May 1st. I believe it was March 1st, or maybe it was March 1st. And we've delayed that. It was either maybe it was May 1st, but we've delayed that now till September. So we're delaying our exit, continuing our imperialism. You see the what we've done, with our interest that we have in Israel, Palestine. Obama was the same. Gaza Strip, was being destroyed and colonized back then under Obama. He got essentially punked around by Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, we have Biden supporting, adamantly supporting these settler colonialists in Israel, who are pushing out, the indigenous peoples, the Palestinians, and occupying their homes, and we are actively supporting that, funding that, because of our geopolitical interest in the region. And that has continued. That policy has continued under Biden. He hasn't moved the embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, knowing that it caused all the violence that it caused from the Israeli government and civilians as well against the Palestinian people, who are by and large severely outmatched in every way. And they are a colonized people trying to just protect their land, and they've gotten the same kind of reaction that they would have gotten from Obama, which is the same kind of treatment that they would have gotten from Donald Trump, if we're being all the way honest with ourselves. And so maybe the rhetoric would be a little bit more flamboyant and loud and aggressive with Trump, but now with Biden, you just kind of quietly get the same sort of policies done. And so yeah, we're seeing by and large a continuation of the Obama era policies, and nothing to meet the moment in the crises that we face, because we are facing these, once in 100-year public health and economic crises and climate crises, and there's just nothing serious being done to engage with those, and to resolve those in a proportional manner.
Yeah, I feel like even relative to Barack Obama's standards, this statement really exposes his inconsistency, because when he talks about his presidency, it always sounds like he always wanted to do a bit more than what he did, but he would often hide behind the excuses of not having the right numbers in Senate, even though there was a supermajority to start off
Yeah.
the first 2 years of his term. Then it became a point where he would blame voters for not having the numbers to get more done. So it was a lot of what it exposed to me was maybe he never wanted to give the people much more than what he actually did.
Absolutely, absolutely. I agree with that. I think that that was always the thing, and this is what I'd say. Just about every politician that I've seen at this stage. I mean, Shama Sawant is probably the only politician that is remaining that I have sort of any admiration for. I mean, there's Lee Carter in Virginia as well, and he's pretty solid. But aside from those two, honestly, and they're operating essentially outside of the Democratic Party as socialists, and aside from those two, it's really, you get this with just about every politician, even the ones that I thought were sincere, like the AOCs and the squad, the so-called squad, the Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, not Ayanna Pressley. I knew exactly what she was, and warned folks of her because she's from my district, and I know that she's sort of an Elizabeth Warren style Democrat. She kind of goes where the wind blows her, and she's still a capitalist at her core and does not really have any intention on fundamentally changing the system. But even those politicians, I think, do something similar where they over promise and under deliver. Always, but in honestly, I don't even think it's an under delivering, like you were saying. It's really that they never really had the intention. I think that some of them are sort of more, there's a maybe a bit of a naivete to them. Maybe I'm giving them a lot of benefit of the doubt here, the sort of squad members and such. That's me being very, very favorable, and my most favorable sort of analysis and read of the situation. But like you said, I don't think that Obama ever had a true intention of doing things, even a public option he campaigned on. He couldn't, he ultimately didn't even bring that to a vote because of Joe Lieberman. And we're seeing the same thing with Joe Manchin now, and Joe Biden hiding behind Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and Mark Kelly and using that as the excuse. And they just kind of rotate out who's going to be the fall guy for each major piece of legislation. But at the end of the day, no matter what, the legislation wouldn't get passed if Biden doesn't support it. At the end of the day, it's not getting passed, and so it really falls on them. And so what Obama promised, like you said, I don't think he ever really meant it. I don't think he ever had any intention of fighting for that kind of change. He said things like he was gonna, go to the picket line and he was gonna wear out his shoes, marching with striking workers. But he never showed up. He never did any of that, and he never really had any intention. He just, he bumped elbows he was more worried about bringing in and trying to work with the Republican Party than he was working with his own base. And this is something that we see from the Democratic Party. They have no intention on serving their so-called base and their most, ardent supporters, the left. They absolutely have no interest in serving the left whatsoever. And it's one of the reasons I think that the left really has to get serious about starting to look outside of electoral politics for our real, to fight for real change in the country, because they've essentially, because of the two-party system, the Democrats know that the left has nowhere else to go. And there's this famous clip of Lawrence O'Donnell talking about something about this and saying how he used to work for the Democratic Party, and he was like, we didn't have to, we ignored the left because, where else were they going to go? Who else were they going to vote for? And so until we show them that we're willing to withhold our vote for the Democratic Party, then they're going to keep on doing this, where they essentially, they get our votes and then they turn their backs on the left and the left priorities and progressive priorities, because they're happy to capitulate to Republicans because that's what their corporate donors want. And so they can serve their corporate donors while, acting as if they're really fighting and they really want it. They just can't get it done because, shucks, those Republicans are just standing in the way. Even though we know, like you said, supermajority for Obama, and now we have the federal trifecta for Joe Biden. So he has, the control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they could absolutely, through budget reconciliation, pass a whole bunch of progressive legislation. But Joe Biden wakes up every morning and decides not to cancel student loan debt, and not to decriminalize cannabis and the war on drugs. So he makes these political decisions every single day, and it's the same kind of, they put on the appearance of being progressive, and the corporate media will write stories about how progressive Joe Biden is and how he's the next FDR, when in reality, none of the changes, none of the policies that he has implemented are lasting policies. They're all very short-term, short-term boost to unemployment, one-time stimulus payments, and a short-term child tax credit that expires at the end of the year. And so nothing like what FDR did when he implemented Social Security in for the first time, a Medicare and a jobs guarantee, a unemployment insurance. So these were GI Bill, like these were permanent changes and permanent legislation to meet the moment, and we've seen nothing like that from the Democratic Party.
I think you brought up a good point about bringing up the people, because I still think some of the left is still caught up on the idea of it's just a matter of getting the right people in. And when I reacted to Kyle Kalinski's third party rant, I think there's some people who are still too caught up on the idea of just changing the people rather than refocusing our electoral efforts towards policy. And that means direct ballot measures and anything that takes away the decision making of just about 400 plus people in the House and the 100 plus people in Senate. And I think that we have to acknowledge that even if there's several progressives around the country that we do like, that the likelihood of them following through and suddenly transforming the rest of the progressives into fighters is like a lottery ticket at this point.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I don't think that you change the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party changes you. It's too much of a machine. It's a well-oiled machine. It's operating exactly how it's intended, which is to serve the wealthy, the ruling class, and to leave working class and poor people behind. It doesn't feel like that's where its donor base is at, and so it doesn't feel like it needs to pay attention to the grassroots sort of base of the progressive base of the party. And so yeah, I think that this is a trap that we keep on falling for, where we, like you said, keep this idea that we keep on saying there's systemic problems in this country. It's systemic problems. And the thing about systemic problems is that they require systemic solutions. Like, they require fundamental changes to the system. And so if you don't change the system and you just change the individuals within the system, that's not changing the system. And so if you think that our our electoral system is a systemic problem, then you have to change the system. And the only way to do that is, like what you said, it has to happen through things like, ballot initiatives. We have to get as close as we can to direct democracy as possible, because this illusion of democracy that we have in this country at this point is not healthy for any of us. And honestly, there's so much time and money and energy being sucked up by these so-called progressive politicians, and ultimately we're getting nothing for that. We're getting no return on investment for these all the time and money and energy we're spending on these campaigns. And I was one of those people. I volunteered for Bernie Sanders. I volunteered for AOC. I made phone calls for her. I donated thousands of dollars even while I was unemployed. I was using unemployment money, like money I just did. It was like money to buy food or donate to this politician. And it's literally making decisions like that, like pay this bill or donate to this politician. And I really believed with all my heart, for starting in sort of 2017 and beyond, I really believed with all my heart that that was an investment that we were making as people that were grassroots donors to these campaigns. I really did believe that that was like investing. And I thought that, okay, well, if I just invest enough in enough of these people and we get enough of them in there, then they'll have enough strength in numbers to actually get something done. And we saw with the Force the Vote was the first time it was really clear. It started to become clear that they weren't going to vote together and in unison and cohesively, and then with the $15 minimum wage. And so, and now we just see, even with Biden and his infrastructure bill, which I'm sure we'll get to talking about, it just keeps shifting to the right, just like it did with this COVID relief bill. And so there's no real outlet that we have in electoral politics, and the idea that we're going to get another person in there that's going to be different somehow. I met AOC before she ever beat Joe Crowley. I talked to AOC. I got to speak to her for about 30 minutes. She came to Boston and she did this really small event because nobody knew who AOC was back then, because she only had a handful of supporters at that point. And I was one of the first 300 people. If you go on the FEC website and look at all the contributions to AOC of all time, I'm one of the first 300 people in the country on the planet to ever donate to AOC. And so I caught on to her campaign early. I supported it. I put all this money and effort into the Justice Democrats, and ultimately it was a failed experiment, looking at it, because they've had multiple chances now to show that they can, even recently with the $1.9 billion that they increased funding to police in the wake of the Capitol riot. That was, a time where we should be thinking about defunding police. The police were a part of it. They assisted in it. But instead, the answer is always to throw more money at policing. And these were folks that all came out and made strong statements about defunding the police. And when push came to shove, they increased funding to police. So, I agree 100% with what you said. I don't think that any individual, I don't think, as left as I am, as socialist as I am, I don't think that I could go to Congress and change that. If the reality is, if you are the type of person that can succeed at winning an election, then the way the system is designed is that you're not going to be somebody that is so, that is a true radical or revolutionary. And so you end up being somebody that's willing to sort of capitulate and work within the system and work within the bounds. And so the reality is, even if one of us somebody like us was to try to get into office, the likelihood is that we wouldn't be able to make it at that level, particularly at the federal level of politics here. And so the this idea, like, say Nina Turner is gonna go change something. I just don't. I wanted to believe in Nina Turner. I wanted to be excited for Nina Turner. She's gonna win. It looks like she's crushing it in a recent poll. Beating the next closest person by over like nearly 40 points. And so it looks like she's gonna win. I was a longtime supporter of her campaign, but I struggle to get. I just can't be excited about electoral politics at this point because I've seen the outcomes, and there's been no. They're willing to vote individually, not as a block, and that means that they don't have an understanding of how to use power and leverage for the sort of leftists. They don't understand what the Tea Party clearly understood and have not been as effective as the Tea Party ever was. And so, yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think you might be muted, Andrew. I'm not getting your audio, just a heads up.
Oh, forgot to unmute
Okay,
myself.
next. Yeah, no worries.
But next, I'm going to get into an article from a couple key points from the recent ruling from the Senate parliamentarian, the new favorite shield for the Democrats to hide behind. So
Yeah.
I'm going to crash real quick. Senate parliamentarian Elizabeth McDonald has effectively ruled that only one more automatic budget reconciliation is permissible this year, dealing a blow to Democrats who previously thought they would have two more chances to sidestep Republicans in advancing President Biden's agenda. McDonald ruled that a revision to the 2021 budget resolution cannot be automatically discharged from the Senate Budget Committee, meaning Democrats would need at least one Republican on the 11-11 panel to vote with them. The bombshell ruling effectively means Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer will only be able to use one more reconciliation vehicle to pass Biden's key legislative priorities this year. He will not be able to divide up the $2.3 trillion American Jobs Plan and $1.8 trillion American Families Plan, as well as Biden's calls to expand Medicare and lower the price of prescription drugs into multiple reconciliation packages, as was only envisioned a few weeks ago. So, Kahmali, what do you think of how they're allowing the Senate parliamentarian to dictate how they pass their agenda, and also how they're not going through with getting rid of the filibuster?
Yeah, I think that this is, we never even heard of a parliamentarian until the Democrats had this federal trifecta of power where they're in control of the White House, the Senate, and the House now. And they have the ability to now pass legislation without the excuse of saying that the Republicans are blocking us, using a process that has been used in essentially every, administration, called budget reconciliation, and the way that it's a convoluted process, but so is this idea of a Senate parliamentarian. This is an unelected official who has no actual power, the Senate parliamentarian. And again, nobody ever heard of a Senate parliamentarian. People who cover politics for a living, I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. And until Elizabeth McDonough came out with this, the first time around with the COVID relief bill, I had never heard of a Senate parliamentarian, and I've heard a multitude of, political analysts and commentators say the same. Nobody's ever heard of this position. It's only an advisory role. They essentially give advice to the president of the Senate president, which is the vice president of the country, Kamala Harris, and so she has the ability to essentially overrule the Senate parliamentarian. And if she overrules the Senate parliamentarian, then it becomes you would then need over 50 votes to block her overruling, essentially. And so you can easily overrule the Senate parliamentarian. The Republicans also just fired their Senate parliamentarian when the parliamentarian tried to give advice that they didn't like. So we've seen there's historical precedent for getting rid of the Senate parliamentarian and just picking a new one that will do as they're told. But this is an unelected official, and this is not what democracy looks like. For an unelected official to be making decisions like whether or not we have a $15 minimum wage in this country, one unelected individual is the absolute definition of authoritarianism, and there's nothing democratic about that process. So the idea that the quote unquote Democratic Party is hiding behind the idea of an unelected official giving advice on this when there's clear channels for them to overrule that is just it's a smoke screen really, and it's just meant to distract and to give the appearance as though they're actually fighting when they're not, and that their hands are just tied. It sort of reminds me of that fake tough guy who's at some event or something, or out somewhere, and they're picking a fight, and then somebody steps back to them, and they're like, oh no, and they throw their friend's hand around them, and they're like, hold me back, and their friend lets it go, and they're just like, no, hold me back. It's like they want somebody there pretending like there's somebody there holding them back, and they would love for it to have been the Republican Party if they didn't win those two runoff elections in Georgia. They would have loved to just been able to say that, throw up their hands and say, oh, the Mitch McConnell and the Republicans keep blocking all our legislation. They don't have that excuse, and so now they come with something called a Senate parliamentarian. The reality is we all knew that. I mean, history tells you can typically use, the rule says you can use budget reconciliation 3 times for one single budget. You get an annual budget. You can essentially use it 3 times. You can use it for in the as long as the legislation affects spending or revenue. And there's one other instance that I'm just blanking on right now. And so you technically you have at max 3 chances to use budget reconciliation. It's never been used more than twice in a single year, and typically it gets used twice in a single year using another provision, not the spending versus revenue provision, but rather the fact that you can do a budget for the following year. So they could essentially do a budget reconciliation in 2020 for the 2021 budget. And this is what the Republicans did in, I believe it was 2017 or 2018. That's how they pushed through the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts that gave just a $6 trillion giveaway to the wealthiest people in the country and corporations, at the same time cutting about $4.5 trillion of federal spending for some of our most important social programs, stuff like Meals on Wheels, and so that feeds the elderly essentially. And so this is just one more pretending, just a false, narrative being spun by the Democrats that they have no power here, when the reality is they do have all the power to get this infrastructure deal done. Now, the reality is they likely do only have one real chance to use budget reconciliation again. And what budget reconciliation does is it's a process that just allows them to go around the filibuster. They can't be blocked by a filibuster, so they can use a simple majority, 50 votes plus 1. They're tied 50-50 in the Senate, and then the vice president comes in and votes. So the Democrats, without getting a single vote from a Republican, which they will not get on any of these, on any of their infrastructure packages, they will not get a single Republican vote. So they're going to have to use the budget reconciliation. The fact that they're trying to split the bill up is already a cop out, essentially. That I don't like a cab, but it's a cop out essentially of being able to say that they're going to pretend like they want to try to do these 2 bills when the reality is there's only no Republicans are going to vote on either of these bills. So in order to go around, like you said, the filibuster says you got to get over 60 votes, and they're completely unwilling to nuke the filibuster. And honestly, I don't think that it would be useful with the Democrats, with this Democratic Party, to nuke the filibuster, because they wouldn't do anything with it. They would just use the excuse of Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema, and they'll say there's one moderate Democrat that they can't get to vote on this legislation, and they'll block it. And so even having the 50 vote threshold, I don't think would help with working class people. They don't want that. They don't want to have that ability to do that. Now, so with this budget reconciliation, since they only have one more chance at it for the year, which is what the parliamentarian now has come and ruled, which again, regardless of whether or not she ruled that way, they were only going to get one more max anyhow, just because that's the historical precedent for it. It's really tough. I thought that Bernie Sanders being the head of the I forget what the budget I forget what the budget committee, Senate Budget Committee is what it's called. So Bernie Sanders is the chair of the Senate Budget Committee. So if anyone was going to be able to use budget reconciliation 3 times in 1 year, it would have been Bernie Sanders because he actually does, generally believe in those sort of social democratic ideology and policies. But even with Bernie Sanders, it looks like they're not going to get the three. So they have to stuff everything they can into one at this point, because what it means is that you get one more vote for this year, one more bill that you can pass with a simple majority, which means you get one more major bill to pass. That's not going to be some corporate friendly bill. So it's really incumbent on them to put as much as they can. And so you have to ask yourself, why are they omitting things like a public option, which Joe Biden campaigned on, universal pre-kindergarten, raising corporate taxes, raising the capital gain tax. Like people should be familiar with the fact that capital gains, when you earn money from money in the stock market, that income is taxed at a far lower rate than the money that you make if you go and work out in the hot sun as a construction worker, or whatever work you're doing as a service worker, the hard work that those folks are doing as an essential worker. You're taxed at a far higher rate than a millionaire or billionaire is being taxed for earning money that they just make while sitting on their asses. So you have to ask yourself, why is none of that even in this bill? It's because they don't really believe in any of that stuff. And so this is all just a smoke screen, and it's really their intention, and they're doing exactly as they intended.
Yes, I think the most frustrating part that you see from the Democratic Party is they really have a big opportunity to use the power of their good to undo the Republican bad, and also make it to where, if doing things like ending the filibuster, they have the ability to make it to where they could pass something for once where the Republicans can't roll back on. You saw early in the Trump presidency where they talked about repealing the Affordable Care Act, even if that wasn't good enough for the left. The point is, it was something that the Democrats did do, but the Republicans weren't really willing to roll back on. Just like how now Joe Biden has just offered to give up on repealing the 2017 Trump tax cuts. And what were your thoughts on that recent development?
Yeah, I think that is just it's absurd to me that Joe Biden is pretending like he is being forced to negotiate with Republicans, when again, no Republican is going to vote in favor of this infrastructure bill, no matter how low they drop it to. If they drop it to 500 billion, it was supposed to be 2.3 trillion. The progressives wanted it at 10 trillion. Joe Biden offered up 2.3 trillion. The Republicans countered with 500 billion. Then Joe Biden, which direction does he move in? He starts to negotiate with the Republicans, supposedly, and starts to shift it downward. Now it went from 1.7 trillion. Now he's dropped it down even lower than that, and he said that he may be willing to go as low as potentially under 1 trillion, which is literally what the Republicans are offering right now. So he's saying he may be willing to go with with the Republican infrastructure bill, and at the same time not raising the corporate tax rate. And that's just raising it halfway back to where Trump lowered it to. So even what he was proposing initially was woefully insufficient, because, and the reality is, this corporate tax rate, that's the official tax rate. The effective tax rate for most of these large, some of the largest corporations in this country, their effective tax rate is actually negative, meaning we pay them, the federal government pays them money at the end of the year when they file their taxes. Folks like Amazon and FedEx, Walmart. So these are major corporations that through tax loopholes are able to skirt taxes anyways, particularly federal taxes. And so they are paying an effective tax rate at or below zero, meaning they're paying no money, or they're getting money back, meaning most working class people making minimum wage are paying more in taxes than Amazon, the corporation, the multi-billion-dollar corporation. administration paid last year. So, it was already insufficient, what Joe Biden was proposing to raise it from, it was lowered to 21% from 35% to 21%. And Biden was proposing to raise it to 28%. So not even raising it all the way back up to where Trump originally lowered it from. So it wasn't even going to be a restoration of the Obama era corporate tax rate. But even that he's now capitulated on and said that he's willing to negotiate again with Republicans who will not vote for this. There will be not a single Republican vote on this infrastructure package. And, hear me now, quote me later. Like, watch when it happens. I promise you, there will not be a single Republican vote in favor of this infrastructure bill, no matter how low he goes. And so the reality is, the only way they're going to be able to pass this is with budget reconciliation, meaning they're going to have to get all the Democrats, and that's it. And all they need is all the Democrats on board. And so anything that we get, I don't want to hear the excuse from Democrats that this had anything to do with Republicans, and nobody should be blaming Republicans for anything. This is a fake, false negotiation that's happening right now. There's no reason to negotiate with those people. Those people aren't going to make a deal with you, no matter how much you negotiate your way down. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is Biden even pretending now to negotiate with Republicans and the so-called moderate or corporate wing of the Democratic Party, and not the progressives? And the reason is because the progressives that have been elected to Congress are ineffective. They have shown no ability. They've shown no ability to use their power as a voting bloc. And mind you, we have the narrowest margin in the House of Representatives that we've had since 1880. So this is well over 100 years. This is something like 140 years since we've had a margin this small, and we have more so-called progressives, more members of the so-called squad than we have a margin between Democrats and Republicans in the House of Representatives, meaning they do have power. They have the power on a bill where no Republican is going to vote in favor of it. They have the power to say, we will not vote. And this is a must-pass bill, mind you. Joe Biden, he does not have his presidency will be ruined if he does not. That's what a must-pass bill is. So COVID relief bill was one, and infrastructure bill is going to be the other. And so he must pass this infrastructure bill. So you have a must-pass bill with no Republican support. That means the Democrats, the progressives in Congress, the so-called squad or the Justice Democrats, they have enough of a block of elected officials there that they could withhold their vote unless they get different guarantees from out of this bill, and unless that they negotiate upward on the bill. But they are unwilling to use their power as a voting bloc. Instead, they say, goofy things that show that they have no understanding of power, like to say that they all vote individually. That's not how, there's a position in Congress called the whip. And the whip is responsible for going around and making sure that they get enough votes. And so you talk to your colleagues and you whip up votes from your different colleagues. So this is not new to anyone in Congress. And so they know exactly that it's crucial. That's why there are such thing as caucuses in Congress. You have the Congressional Progressive Caucus. You have you have these different, the Black, Congressional Black Caucus. So they have different caucuses, the Congressional Latino Caucus. So different caucuses because the understanding is we're going to vote in unison on legislation that affects this type of group. And so here because the so-called progressives, so-called squad has shown time and time again at this point that they are unwilling to use their leverage to actually enact any type of change. Now they don't even have to negotiate with them, and that's why we see these bills moving further and further to the right under the guise of negotiating with Republicans. But the reality is that the Democrats are negotiating with themselves.
Yeah, you just said it perfectly about the frustrations you have with all sectors of the Democratic Party. You have Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, they're obstructing just the average part of the Democratic Party. Then you've got the progressives, the squad and their neighboring progressives, who aren't doing anything to help use their leverage to pull the party back left. Then you've got their supporters not being on board with tenets of force the vote, even though if they got on board, it would actually help their all-in strategy of the Democratic Party reform. And since no one's doing anything, it's going to lead to a pretty big slaughtering unless people don't want to deal with the culture war that the Republicans are currently in right now.
Yeah, it's come 2022 and 2024. We already know historically the opposition party gained seats in midterms. Historically, like it would be highly improbable, even if the Democrats had done, positive, good things for people, that they would gain seats. The hope would be that they could just maintain their current numbers would be the best hopes. But the fact that they are not delivering on, Joe Biden is not delivering on his basic campaign promises, and his campaign promises were so already so inadequate and just the absolute bare minimum. And the fact that he couldn't even deliver on those bare minimum campaign promises really is setting the Democratic Party up for as Obama put it, a shellacking come 2022. So in those midterms, I fully expect at this stage to see the Democrats lose seats, not only in the Senate, where they'll lose the control of the Senate, but they have a real chance to lose enough seats and lose control of the House as well, I think, at this stage, because of the abysmal job that they're doing and the fact that they have, done nothing to really feed their base and to excite their base. So you have a lot of nihilism and cynicism, just a creeping sort of demoralization of the really active volunteer base, which is the left base of the party. And so this is the point where we really are on the precipice of what is likely to be a real ass whooping, for lack of a better term, by the Republicans against the Democrats and come midterms, and then in the 2024 election, I think as well, we're going to see some repercussions from this, because the reality is that the first 100 days is typically when the most legislation is passed, and that 100 days is come and gone, and all we got was a temporary COVID relief bill and nothing more. And it's hailed as this super progressive bill, but look at the crises that we were facing. We never had a pandemic overlapping with an economic recession, particularly one of that nature that we haven't seen essentially since the Great Depression in this country in 1930. So and we haven't seen a pandemic or a public health crisis like this since 1918. So over 100 years ago. So these are once in a century type of crises, and they're overlapping for the first time in our history. And what we've met the moment with is insufficient. And so it will come as no surprise to me when the Democrats lose seats, and then at that point they'll be able to use their favorite excuse, which is the Republicans are blocking us, Mitch McConnell won't let us do it, and nothing is going to get done for the final 2 years of the Biden administration. So everything, and honestly, soon enough they're going to start to tell us that we can't criticize Joe Biden because it's getting too close to midterms. And so they're going to start to, I guarantee you what they're going to do is, no matter how much we all know and we can all see with our own two eyes that it is clearly the fault of the Democratic Party and the establishment and the elected officials that have not met their promises. We know it's going to be their fault that they lose seats, but I guarantee you that they will turn around and blame the left for it. They'll say, you were too harsh. You helped the Republicans by criticizing Joe Biden, and look, he was doing good things and he did all these nice things, and you still criticize them because we're recognizing the moment and realizing that he's not doing enough, and just trying to beg him to please do enough that you'll get the votes. Like you said, it's good strategy. It's not just good, it's good political strategy as well. It's not just good policy, it's good politics as well. So them doing this is a way for, by passing good legislation that helps a lot of people. One, you help a lot of people, great, working class and poor people, that's awesome. But then you also help yourself by doing it. And that's the sad thing, is that they don't want to. They want to be a party out of power so that they can simply use the Republicans as their new excuse, instead of having to put heat on Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema will be able to vote and pretend like they're progressive, and they'll vote in favor of all these progressive policies all of a sudden, just like Kamala Harris voted in favor or co-sponsored Medicare for all, but then turned around and completely flip-flopped on it as soon as push came to shove. So they're happy to support progressive policy when they're not in power, because they know that nothing's going to come of it. So that's what they're looking forward to, and I think that this is all part of their plan. Absolutely.
So since we're down to about the last 10 minutes or so of your time, I wanted to get your thoughts on how white leftists, they often try to tell black leftists how to organize and how far right they can reach out to people, and it tends to end up with black leftists getting attacked, and it becomes a weekly discussion point on Twitter. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that by and large, I think that black liberation should be primarily left up to people deserve self determination, and so black folks are a colonized people in this country just like indigenous folks, and we deserve colonized peoples to have a right to self determination, and I believe that it is it should be up to those groups and those folks of those communities to work amongst themselves and to be able to figure it out in a way that's not, paternalistically being sort of dictated down to by the sort of predominantly white left. And so I think that any black leftist that you ask the question to will tell you by and large they'd like, the ability to just sort of, not be paternalized and to just have a right to self-determination. So by and large, I think that, black folks know how to organize in black communities for the most, by and large. And we have been doing so for time in memoriam, and it's been a job that we have no problem doing, and we are we continue that work. And there's there's varying opinions on within the black left, and so people will find white leftists, they'll find that if they have a view on this, there's gonna be a black leftist out there that supports that their view of it. So because black folks are not black people are not a monolith, black leftists are not a monolith, there's a lot of diversity even amongst the black left, and you have a lot of variations on who believes who is worth working with, and that sort of ideology. I fall into the camp personally of the more of the sort of black socialist in America camp of like, it's really the idea of like working with fascist or overt racist in any way is by and large the work that could be done there is mostly a waste of time and unproductive for us, because there's plenty of people out there that are going to be pushed away by those sort of alliances. And honestly, aligning with certain people, my personal opinion is aligning with certain people like certain sort of fascist and people that have sort of fascist mindsets and ideologies, to try to align with them, because we may both together hate the liberals and we may have a common enemy, but just because two sets of people have a common enemy doesn't mean they have a shared goal. And I think that our vision of what we want to see this world become is vastly different from most sort of far right individuals, and so there's a certain level of people that I'm just not willing to try to engage with, and I don't think that there's any value to any leftist trying to engage with certain people of certain far sort of extreme right ideologies, fascists in any way, racist of a certain certain level of just overt racist, that I don't think that there's any value in trying to work with those people, because I believe personally that it makes the space unwelcoming to black folks that might be on our side passively. Like, there are a lot of black folks that are just disengaged from politics, and they agree with us passively. If you go down the list of policies and different ideas, they agree. The universal health care, reparations for black folks, raising the minimum wage to at least $20 at this point or more, things like that. There are black folks that certainly the vast majority of them would agree with you on these policies that most would consider leftist. But the problem is they're just disengaged from politics because they've seen no matter which party comes into power, their lives aren't being changed, their lives aren't being improved, whether even if it's under Obama. We saw Obama, and most people's black wealth evaporated more so than any other recent presidency because of the housing crisis under Obama. And so we and in Obama's response to that in particular, of bailing out the banks and not bailing out the poor working class family. So, my personal thoughts on it, as far as like, this idea of like organizing with certain folks, and like, there's been a lot of like discussion, like there's been, because the Boogaloo Boys and folks like that. And I think that if you look at what they are looking for, this idea of like, we're just going to destroy the state, I do think that it's a kind of issue where we got to really think about, when we're aligning ourselves with those people, what are the outcomes that they're looking for? Because to them, maybe we agree, oh, we want to tear down the state, but leftists and anarchists and even authoritarian leftists, we have a very specific idea of what we want to replace it with, and it's something that's good for poor and working class people everywhere. And on the other hand, for a lot of right wingers, it's sort of a more libertarian, free market fundamentalism, may the best man win kind of thing, and typically it is a man in those societies. And so they're perfectly happy to sort of work with us in that regard, because they know that in the event of a power vacuum, in the event that we just tear down the state and just tear down the government, like what happened on January 6th, if we say we support stuff like that, because sure, we're against the liberals and we're against, the state as it is right now, but we our idea of what to replace it with is very different than what what some of those folks want to replace it with. In particular, the Boogaloo Boys, from my understanding, even the name came out of this idea of starting a second civil war. And in the event of something like that, in the event of a power vacuum, the right wingers have all the power. In the event of a power vacuum, they have the money, they have the guns in this country, so they will be the dominant force, and they know that they can win out in that. So for lefties to try to work with certain folks, listen, the Black Panthers, they were able to work with folks that were considered racist at the time, but they denounced their racism. The Young Patriots, they denounced that racism. They grew up in racist environments, but they were able to set that aside and say, all right, well, if we really do agree on this, we have to agree on a certain basic level of like, you have to agree that I'm a full human being, and you have to believe in, like, I can't work with somebody or debate somebody on the idea of like, are Black people more than 3/5 of a human being, or are trans people, are trans women, are trans men. Like, I can't debate with somebody on basic levels of like, just basic humanity like that, and I'm not going to waste time doing that, and I don't think that we should. Now, if somebody decides to do that, like, good, I don't have a critique that strong where I'm like, I even want to tell even a white leftist, necessarily how they should be organizing. Sure, there's some people out there, if you can deprogram white supremacists, there's some guy out there, I forget, some Black guy that does that, like, good for you. I don't think that that's an effective strategy, and I think that the time that you spend doing that, you could get 10 times as many disaffected, poor black voters on your side that don't think that you're, less than a human being. So, my thought, that's sort of my very long-winded way of saying, like, I think that the goal should be, we shouldn't try to spend as much time critiquing one another, particularly white leftists telling Black leftists how to organize. I think that is incredibly paternalistic and condescending, and I think that you'll find that it creates a tension between Black and white leftists that we don't want to have. And so if we want to make this left welcoming to Black and brown and other marginalized peoples, I think we have to recognize that those people deserve a seat at the table and a right to self-determination. And so we should try to do our best to help platform those people and other marginalized groups and work with them in solidarity, but to, when we're in their spaces, to try to kind of just, sort of, shut up and listen, because we've had a lot of privilege. I have a whole bunch of like cis male, college educated type of privilege. And so I have to recognize that. And when I'm in queer spaces or other spaces like that, or women's spaces, and try to, particularly with Black women or other, indigenous women and other women of color, and to try to give them space and a platform to speak, and not try to paternalistically determine what is best for them. I don't think that ever plays well. And so that's not what solidarity looks like. I think solidarity looks a lot more like just, trying to give space to those folks, support them in ways that they say they need support, and just back them on that, and not try to, sort of feels like it's family business kind of stuff, where it's like, we'll handle our family, we got it. It's family business. You don't take family business out onto the streets and stuff and try to handle it out publicly. So yeah, that's my general thought, is like, let folks organize how they see fit, and I try to criticize less how each person is, doing their particular activism. I believe in a sort of one size fits all, but I do have a sort of a pretty stern belief that the working with the sort of Boogaloo Boys may come at the cost of getting a lot of sympathetic black and other marginalized people onto our side, just because they see that and their sort of surface level understanding of somebody like the Boogaloo Boys is an organization that is based around the idea of a second civil war and has, racist roots. Even if there may be some good people within that movement, I think that what that means is you can be a Boogaloo Boy and work with, leftists. It just doesn't mean that the Boogaloo Boys organization, necessarily can work with black leftists until they denounce their sort of, that ideology and actually align with us on our end goals. I think that we should be very careful with organizing with folks like that. So that's my sort of, I haven't gotten to say that part publicly, to share that thought. So sorry for sort of going beyond the scope of your question, but that's both my thoughts on just the actual organizing within the black community and for black leftists, as well as how I think that the white leftists and other leftists in sort of wealthier positions should allow poorer black and folks to have a space and ability to organize and self-determine.
Yeah, I just wanted to drop in one last thought. The issue I have with the white leftists and that white savior complex is that it falsely implies that these far right groups have just as much power as the white supremacists that are in the politicians that make the laws that affect our lives every day, and they only have power when they commit acts of violence right now. And also, there's this false assumption if those groups just happen to have a few people who would be for an issue like Medicare for all, that they would be working with us when they could just be trying to convince their people independently of us on the left to do it.
Exactly, because that's what I say. I say that's the point that I always make to people. It's like if they actually agree with us on these issues, then there's no need for us to lock arms together and sing kumbaya together. It's like, if you actually believe in this issue, then you'll go and you'll work on it with your set of people, right? And we'll work on it with our set of people, and we'll come together in common spaces when we meet up on that one issue. If it's really an issue that we believe in that, so something like, the January 6th riot, I do not believe that that's a good idea. If you believe in Medicare for all or a Green New Deal or a $15 minimum wage, then there's no way that you can believe in something like just tearing down the Capitol, because if we tear down the government, then there's no chance for enacting something like a Medicare for all as we envision it now, or a Green New Deal as we envision it now, a federal jobs guarantee, things like this. There's no way of enacting that without a government. The government is what's by and large been, sadly, it's the few little protections that a lot of marginalized groups have comes through the state and through the government right now. So we have to be really careful as leftists about this idea of just tearing down the government. I wholeheartedly believe in the concept of dual power. And the idea of dual power is that you don't just tear down some system over here. The system over here is crumbling all on its own. What we need to do as leftists is start to build up new systems of our own in the sort of ashes of this crumbling, capitalist system. And so what our job is to do is to try to actually do the positive affirmative work, and not necessarily to worry about about the actual tearing down of the system, especially in violent ways where against police forces, where we know how the police can enact wanton violence against black and brown and other marginalized people. And so, I don't want to put people at risk. Fred Hampton famously said about the SDS Weathermen when they were doing these sorts of dangerous actions where they were putting people in the position of getting having police be violent against them. And so I think that there's a way, like you said, exactly what you said is right to me. It's if these folks actually align with us on these issues, then it's not about having to work with them in that way. We don't have to like be their best friends and or anything like that. If we agree on something like anti-war movements, then we're gonna get together when there's some sort of anti-war protest or something. They'll be there and we'll be there, and we're not gonna step on each other's toes or fight each other because we have a shared goal at that point. And that doesn't mean that we're working on, we're working together in some broader context. And so I absolutely believe that that's the real way to go about this. Is like, let them, if some libertarians want to work with us on something like, ending, legalizing cannabis and ending the war on drugs and anti-war movements, and even some conservatives, for whatever reason, like if they want to work with us on those things, then we'll just happen to get together on those particular issues in the spaces where it actually matters, or we happen to vote on the same, in the same way, or for the, if we're doing direct ballot measures, like what we saw in Florida for the minimum wage. Minimum wage passed with 60% in Florida under, direct democracy. There were some conservatives, that means, that voted for that, because Florida is practically 50-50, Democratic, Republican. And so that means there were some Republican voters that voted for it. There were some Democratic voters that voted for it, some leftists, some right wingers that all voted for it. And it's like, just because we do that, we don't have to pretend like we're best friends and like we're working together. We're much better off spending our time and our energy trying to work with people that at least passively agree with us, rather than people that actively disagree with us on fundamental issues like how we actually want the world to, how we envision the world being in the wake of a failed capitalism. So I think those are really important things. And yeah, I think the point you raise is a really crucial one, and I'm glad you mentioned that.
Oh, yes, thank you. That was a really great answer overall. So, Kamali Rose, do you have anything to plug before you head out?
Folks can find our show, The Radical Democracy Show, on YouTube and Twitch. It's YouTube. Like I said, you just search for Radical Democracy on YouTube. You'll find us. You can find me on Twitter at On to the Fifth on Twitter. And so yeah, find us there. We also appreciate any support that we can get on Coffee and Patreon. Coffee is our preferred donation spot just because they take the least from creators. So that's ko-fi.com/radical democracy. And you can also find us on Patreon, patreon.com/radical democracy. And again, if you can't afford it, don't worry about it. Don't stress out about it all. A lot of folks are hurting right now, and we don't want to put any other stress or burden on people. But if you can afford to do so, we really do appreciate the support. So as low as $1, you can do a one-time donation or a monthly donation. We appreciate whatever you can afford. So thank you so much to everyone. And, make sure if you're coming here from the Radical Democracy Show, make sure you sub to Andrew Rochford, the Rochford Files here, and get some leftist political and sports commentary.
Oh, yes, thank you. And it was great having you on today, and I look forward to having you back on as a guest again in the future.
Awesome. Great being on. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
And that was Kamali Rose of the Radical Democracy Show. That was a great answer at the end. He really gave some long, detailed answers, and I really appreciated that from him. So, with that being said, please go subscribe to the Rochford Files on YouTube, follow the show on Twitch, like the Facebook page of the Rochford Files as well. I apologize for my connection issues today. I know that my webcam and screen presentation wasn't in good quality today, but my guest he overcame that for me, and he delivered some great answers, especially at the end about black leftists organizing on the right and issues with how the white leftists are presenting it as a matter of equating the far right's group powers in line with the white supremacist politicians that we have right now carrying that agenda over. So with that being said, please come back on Monday. The show will be a later start time of 4 p.m. Eastern. My guest will be Sabby Sabs who has just recently joined the Fred Hampton Left. So I really look forward to hearing from her as well. So please come back, stay with me on that. And over the weekend, I do plan to have a Nuggets and Suns playoff series preview show. So I'm going to look for a couple people on Nuggets Twitter, try to find a Suns fan who wants in on this playoff preview as well. I'm not sure. I think it'll be Sunday. I think Sunday will be a better day to try to do it. So I so that's another thing that's coming up as well. But more importantly, Sabby Sabs Monday, 4 p.m. Eastern. So that'll be a hour later than normal. But we still plan to have a pretty spontaneous end time on that. So with that being said, have a good rest of your night. And I'll see y'all sometime over the weekend. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at NugLifeComrade, NUGGLIF Comrade, and the Rochford Files show page, A Rochford Files. As I further build up the show page, it'll have more than 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So don't forget to come back over the weekend and Monday. And this is Andrew Rochford